It's in progress.
All right, go ahead.
Good morning. This is the second of a two-part series. Subject is exploring our Episcopal identity. Our speaker is the Reverend Dr. Warren Cruz. He has a PhD in historic theology from St. Louis University. He's a former rector of St. Tim's. He has been associate rector, Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Webster Groves. He's presently retired and is priest associate at Emmanuel Church. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cruz.
Thank you, Gary. Well, thank you for those of you who are coming back for round two, and welcome also to those who weren't able to be here last time. A little piece of news. I've asked Amy to send to you the slides, so you will be able to go through them. It's just one set, both part one and part two. So it's just one thing. And she has two lists. She has the adult forum list. If you're not on that, see Amy. And the other is just going to be a link in the parish. The Angelus, is that it? No, not that. That's yeah. Angelus is a manual. Yes. Okay. So we did part one. Part one was our identity in the past. And I began last time by saying, and I'll add a little bit to it, because I think this is an important context. What we're experiencing in this country and probably around the world is a decay, a slow, sometimes rapid decay of a sense of identity in all of our major institutions. There's hardly any institution left now who isn't struggling with its identity. Just a simple example, the Supreme Court. Who would have thought that the Supreme Court would be struggling with its identity? And this whole question of Justice Thomas and his wife, and how political or not political is the Supreme Court? Our political parties. If you want to talk about the Republican Party struggling, talk to John Danforth of its identity. And those are just two rather obvious examples. And we could go on and on. But companies are doing the same thing. For a long time, companies like to diversify. But what they discovered was that in the avalanche of information, their minds get foggy, and they no longer, if you know 25 things about a company, you're not likely to really have a commitment, as much of a commitment to that company as if you just had a one or two things about it. So more and more of the companies that diversified 20 years ago are now shrinking their identity back to one thing. And I mentioned last time, if you watch the news, but not the news, television, one of the things that always bothers me is I hate to see the same ad 20 times. But you know why they're doing that? So that when you think, like for instance, I'll give you a simple example. There's one on NBC that I see all the time, and I think it's probably elsewhere. It's called the Platinum Roof Company. It's a lovely Black family that owns this nice roof company, a nice building and handsome family. But I've seen that ad. So, but now when I think of roofing, I think of Platinum Roofing. Or I think of the little Geico. Or those weird, what is it? Progressive insurance. You know, sometimes you watch it and you think, what are they advertising? It doesn't matter what the content is. You're remembering Progressive insurance. It's branding. Everything's about branding, so that when you think about that topic, you think about that particular company. So it's all affecting the churches too. And churches that used to emphasize we're all things to all people are now realizing that that doesn't create very much of a loyalty. That people are asking, okay, well, what is it that you have to offer me that the others don't have? And if you're offering a whole lot of things, that doesn't work in that kind of situation. So I thought it would be an interesting series to talk about exploring our Episcopal identity. And we've had a pretty clear identity in the past. And so we took a quick look at Richard Hooker, who was the theologian in the years around the year 1600, who talked about scripture, reason, tradition, those sorts of things, which are still important. But and then later on, experience got added to the list. And then by the middle and late 1800s, there was a desire to expand it even further. Scripture, creeds, sacraments, and the historic episcopate bishops. Those are what identify who we are. And we talked, I asked everybody, well, what is your elevator talk when somebody says, what's an Episcopalian? And we came up with lots of creative ideas. We certainly hadn't mentioned the Book of Common Prayer, the Via Media, our inclusivity. There are all kinds of things that we today would think ought to be in our current elevator talk. So today, we're going to focus on the present. And what I'm going to do is, starting with 1970 is a good shift point. Things that have happened in the Episcopal Church that are building blocks perhaps for an expanded identity or a new set of emphases for our current identity. And then we can discuss that. Okay? So the first one was the prayer book. Now, I happen to have gone through this. For a lot of people, younger people particularly, they don't know what this is about because this is the only prayer book they've ever experienced. But for those of us who go back to the 1928 prayer book, this was a huge change. We shifted from the Elizabethan English in the entire book, which had been that way for centuries, to a contemporary language, the Rite II language. We shifted from a more penitential approach to worship to a more celebratory approach. We moved from a morning prayer centered worship to Eucharist centered worship. And we shifted from baptism from being an individual to being a congregational experience. I remember that one dramatically because in 1970, when my oldest son was born, we had him baptized with the only prayer book, which was 1928 prayer book, in the chapel at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, which was the standard, because baptism was for that individual. 3 years later, our second son was born, and the new baptismal service was in play, and he was baptized on Sunday morning. I know it was an improvement because our older son screamed bloody murder the whole service. Fortunately, it's just the family. And fortunately, our younger son slept through the service for the one in the congregation. But so baptism moved from something that you experience only when somebody in your family is baptized, kind of an individual thing, to a very important thing, because baptism, particularly with the baptismal covenant, shapes who we think we are and what our Christian identity is. Okay, so that was a huge thing. Now, in 1976, the General Convention, finally, after decades of struggle to allow women to be ordained to the priesthood finally happened. It was the same General Convention that approved the new prayer book. It was a very controversial General Convention, but it got done. And then it wasn't too long later that it was expanded to their ordination to the episcopate, to being a bishop. Also, I remember I was ordained in 1965, so I started attending diocesan conventions after that in Oklahoma. And each year we seem to be struggling with what should women be allowed to vote on? Because in 1965, women were not allowed to be on vestries or delegates to convention, you name it, they weren't there. And so one by one, we argued it through and women were allowed to be on vestries and conventions. And now it's interestingly enough, we finally reached 50 years later, we've reached parity. If you look at the picture of the diocesan convention, there'll be as many men and women as each, and likewise with a picture of the clergy or the national conventions. So that's a huge change. The 1960s, of course, in our country was a very tumultuous time. The civil rights movement led to a strong commitment on our church's part to social justice for African Americans. We even had, for the first time ever, an additional General Convention. In 1969, we had a special General Convention to address our commitment to African Americans and funding for things in that relationship. Also, we reaffirmed our strong commitment to Native Americans. We're the only church that has the equivalent of a diocese for Native Americans. It's called Navajo land, because lots of the Navajo are Episcopalians. The majority of Episcopalians in Alaska and South Dakota are Native Americans. And so we have had a very long emphasis on working with them. And as you know, we still have a lot of work to do to help them reach their potential. Also, we're now making a major effort to connect with Hispanics, which is the largest growing ethnic group. And the Diocese of Missouri, if you don't already know, is shifting its companion diocese from Louis in the Sudan, South Sudan, to Puerto Rico, which will involve us in dealing with a Hispanic diocese. And so already the bishop is trying to get us more and more used to bilingual services and so forth, just to see a lot of Spanish. Even the National Cathedral is doing a lot of that. So that's a major change. Then, in addition to this emphasis on inclusivity of race and gender, we added sexual orientation in the year 2004 when we ordained Gene Robinson as our first gay bishop. And then it wasn't too long after that, we provided for the ordination of gay priests, and no longer for marriage rights for LGBTQ people. So sexual orientation, gender, race, all of those are added into the mix of our commitment to being inclusive. But that's a huge change from the time when I became an Episcopalian. Well, let's see, I think I'm ahead of myself here. Well, let me go back. Well, what I'll say is this: when I became an Episcopalian in college in 1960, almost all Episcopalians were white, Anglo-Saxon, and dominated by men in all of the positions. And today, that is not the case. Also, there were our demographics were such that I remember polls showing that 75% of all Episcopalians in 1970 were Republicans. And approximately that percentage were also cradle Episcopalians. Guess what that percentage is for both today? 25%. That's a huge change of who the average Episcopalian is nowadays. I'm not necessarily saying that's better. All I'm saying is that's what has happened. Actually, I do think it is better, but there may be others who think not. Also, the Episcopal Church has, over the decades and so forth, been very active in the ecumenical movement. And so finally, in the year 2001, we established a relationship with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, a full communion, and then there were the Moravians. You probably know who the Lutherans are. The Moravians, you may not know. They're a small Germanic group, more like the Methodists, somewhere in between Lutherans and Methodists, but they've always had bishops, as the Lutherans have too. And we're very close to achieving full communion with the United Methodists. The United Methodists are in a big battle right now. And so they've asked us to kind of wait until they settle their battle. But somewhere in this decade, I suspect we'll find that. Now, full communion allows full interchange of clergy. So if I'm not predicting this will happen, but you could call an ELCA pastor to be the rector of St. Timothy's. You could call a Moravian if you could find one. They're not too many. Likewise, a Lutheran congregation could call an Episcopal priest to be their pastor. So there's a full interchangeability between the churches. So that's a really big deal because it calls on us to be open to the gifts and the strengths of the other churches, as well as their being open to our strengths. And in a lot of small towns where there's a really tiny Episcopal church and a tiny ELCA church, it's the solution to one person taking care of both churches, sort of thing, which we need to work on more and more. We demonstrated our determination to include women and African Americans at every level when we elected as presiding bishop our first woman, Catherine Shorey, in 2006, and our first African American presiding bishop, Michael Curry, in 2015. For that, as I had said, they were all white Anglo-Saxon males. So that's a big change at the top of our church's leadership. Here's the one I was looking for, the 75%. Oh, down at the bottom. One I didn't mention is, if you had asked in 1960, if you had asked the average American understanding of the Episcopal Church, they would have said, it's the church of the wealthy. or at least the church of the prominent. We had more Episcopalian. If you looked at the American Congress, the largest number of legislators would have been Episcopalians. If you look at the list of presidents of the United States, the largest number are Episcopalians. If you looked at the ranks of the VIPs of our society, we would have been strongly represented. Today, I don't think that's the same thing. I think things have changed in that and in all of that. So that's a very important thing. People are not joining the Episcopal Church because they think that will make them more prominent. Now, here is a piece that all of us are having to deal with, and that is that we've experienced a significant decline in membership. In the year 1970, we had 3.4 million people. In 2020, it was down to 1.6 million. That's at least a 50%, more than a 50% drop in the 50 years. That's a long stretch, but still. But the good news is, in 2021, we went up. We actually gained some members in 2021. So maybe things are looking up, but part of it is our changing demographics. Part of it is our shift in social, political positions. And it used to be, I should have said when I first became an Episcopalian, one of the statements where we were the Republican Party at prayer. And I don't think many people would say that today. But that meant a lot of people who wanted to be part of the Church of Republicans at prayer became Episcopalians. But if that's not the case, then some of them went elsewhere. And excuse me, this one might sound funny to you, but one of the things about a shrinking membership is one of the characteristics of Episcopal churches is that they've had large buildings, large, very lovely buildings, large, very expensive buildings. And as congregations have gotten smaller, it became more and more difficult to maintain those buildings. And it just wore people out. A lot of people thought, I'm not going to a church in order to spend all my time and energy keeping a building up. And so that was another one of those changes that affected our churches and our identity. So if somebody came along and said, well, you're too small for your beautiful building, you need to sell your building and move into a storefront or something, because we can be a church in a storefront just like we can in a beautiful Gothic building. Well, that's a change of identity, significant one. Another major factor in our decline, along with most other churches, is the growing secularization of our country. Think of the rise of the nuns. Now, it's not the ones in the black and white. This is no affiliation people. The nuns, they're up. They're growing. It's at least 20% of our population now have no connection with any religion. Also, those who claim to be spiritual, but not religious, that percentage of the population is growing. A lot of the nuns would be in that category too. And this is a much larger percentage among young people than it is older people. And what that has done in a lot of Episcopal congregations meant that those who are still active are growing older. So the average age in an Episcopal congregation now is around 60, which is a lot higher than it was, say, in 1960. Okay. Moving to now, what are we doing about this? How does this affect who we see ourselves to be now, and what should we be doing about it? Well, we elected Michael Curry in 2015, and he will serve through 2024. And that's a wonderful picture of him. He is just the epitome of an extroverted, enthusiastic, infectious enthusiasm, optimism, and so forth. Strong emphasis on mission of the church to spread the loving, transforming gospel of Jesus Christ. Strong emphasis on evangelism, which when I became an Episcopalian was a no word. You didn't mention evangelism. That was something for the Baptists. He loves to talk about us being the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. That's a change. In 1960, when I became an Episcopalian, you would have never heard that. But that is an important piece of what we're hearing today. I would also, I've added a slide to my version of this, which is the one you'll get when it's sent, but I decided we really needed to add one on our current bishop. Dion Johnson is really, to some extent, very much like our presiding bishop. He has the same kind of infectious enthusiasm. He would agree with all of these things about the transforming gospel and evangelism and being a part of the Jesus movement. A couple of things that he has emphasized that I think are important to underline. He says, we must be about mission rather than maintenance. We must be focusing on sharing the gospel rather than spending all our time and energy on maintaining our buildings and our organizations. Mission above maintenance. And then he also has emphasized that the Diocese of Missouri is the Episcopal branch in Eastern Missouri with 42 branches. It's the Episcopal Church in we're the Episcopal Church in the Eastern Missouri with 42 branches. Which, first time I heard that, it reminded me of a story I heard a long time ago. It came from a friend of mine in New Orleans. The downtown New Orleans Rotary Club had a policy that only one person could be, everybody had to have, you had to be Jane Doe and your occupation. And each occupation could only have one person. And so at one point, both the Episcopal bishop and an Episcopal priest applied for membership. Crisis, what to do? Anybody guess what they did? Episcopal bishop was labeled Episcopal wholesale, and the priest was Episcopal retail. Yes. So, but I haven't heard our bishop say that, but the Episcopal diocese is our identity on the wholesale level, if you want. in St. Timothy's is on the retail level, right? But that's a whole different approach to thinking about what the diocese is. Instead of the diocese is a collection of 42 parishes which do their own thing, basically, and we get together every once in a while to do something at the diocesan level. But to see ourselves as the branch offices of the Episcopal Church of Eastern Missouri is a whole different approach to things. Okay. Taking into consideration all of these events, a lot has happened since 1970. How have they changed your understanding of our Episcopal identity? And what are the new emphases and elements that would go into an updated elevator talk? Okay, that's your time. Your turn. Susan.
We need to be better marketers. People don't know, and I don't think everybody needs to know our whole history.
No.
But we do need to be better marketers. This is who we are now. This is who we've become. We've struggled, we're still struggling, but this is who we are. As people, they, are you Catholic? Catholic light.
Catholic light.
Whiskey pale.
Yeah, I heard that a long time ago.
Back in the party days, it wasn't like.
Or
Remember whenever.
Or we're the
3 or
church where you
4
can
are
believe.
gathered, there's always a fifth. I mean.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've heard that one too.
back to the 70s.
Yeah.
But better marketers.
Yes, but good marketing.
Yes.
Good marketing. Yes, but so that raises, of course, the question of how do we want to, we know what some of these branding things, I mean, we're really talking about branding. What should go into that?
We're the marketers.
We are, but that's why I say, what is going to be your elevator talk? When somebody says, "Oh, you're a member of the Episcopal Church," what exactly is an Episcopalian? Your answer, it may be the same as you told me last week, but it may be different. If you take into all of these considerations, what would be? Okay.
Central thing for me is all are welcome.
All are welcome. Okay, the inclusivity of race and gender and sexual orientation and social and economic status, everybody. Okay, that's very much true. Yes.
Social justice.
Social justice. Yes. Okay, social justice for African Americans, for Hispanics, for Native Americans, for women, you name it. Everybody. So,
Parity across genders.
parity.
Across genders in the positions within the church.
Yes, I think we pretty much got that one down, but we're talking now about what you would share with others, that were social justice and inclusive and parity among the genders and so forth. What else? Yeah.
We actually, as opposed to probably most all religions, we elect our leaders, we choose our clergy.
Okay.
We have a daughter who is technically United Methodist Church
Mhm.
living in Kentucky. Well, when
They're appointed, yeah.
had a change recently, that was a sign. by
Yes,
their,
yes.
uh,
So we're democratic.
Yeah.
With a bishop who does have a lot of authority, but choice of our leaders, we're very much, the laity is very much involved in that process. Yes, that is an important piece. Anybody else? Others? Yes, in the very back.
Eucharist centered?
We're Eucharistic centered. That's very important. I would say Eucharistically, another word might be sacramentally oriented. Another word might be the incarnation. We want our religion to be tangible, because if you think about the sacraments, they're tangible. Eucharist is tangible. You're getting bread and wine. Baptism is tangible. You got water. You've got the anointing is tangible. And I think our society has become much more interested in tangible things and less interested in overarching ideas. Not that that's not important, but rather they want those ideas to be included. Maybe another word that's underneath what you just said would be liturgical, because the sacraments are all liturgical. And so you're not going to church and just finding out what the pastor wants to do today. There's something that's predictable about it. And not that there's not variety, but that there's continuity. There's still, I would say, for me, one of the things is it's historic. That's maybe because I'm a historian, but it's not something we just came up with yesterday that we thought might be a neat idea, but rather that the liturgy is part of our tradition. It's something that's evolved. It's sensitive to cultural situations, but on the other hand, it is rooted in the past that goes back all the way to Jesus and the apostles. Any others? Yes.
I think you can come as you are, and you can come with questions. You can come with doubts.
Yes. Okay.
I think we're a church of thinkers, and people don't get defensive or say, this is just the way it is, you have to learn this, but it is always okay to say why, or tell me more, or I'm not sure yet.
Okay.
And it can be a discussion.
We had a little bit of that conversation last week with Hooker's Reason, and going way back to the original. Even before Hooker, someone once asked Queen Elizabeth I, who had so much to do with the formation of the Church of England, being a hybrid of Catholics and Protestants, somebody said to her, well, so-and-so thinks this, but so-and-so thinks that. What are we going to do about this? And Elizabeth said, I don't care what they think, as long as they go to church and use my prayer book. That's kind of been the Episcopal Church. The one thing that doesn't work, I went to church with a friend of mine, and his father was the junior warden, and this was this big church, really big church in Akron, Ohio. It's on the Goodyear Estates, and it's sort of like St. Peter's, but even bigger. And it was morning prayer. I was sitting next to his father, and we were doing, in the morning prayer, you have the Apostles' Creed rather than the Nicene Creed. See, and it sort of went like this. And he had a booming voice. I believe in the born of the Mary. You go along, and anything he wasn't comfortable with just was omitted. And I would go, it's kind of hard to say the Apostles' Creed when somebody is omitting things next to you. That failed Elizabeth's test. Okay, so you don't think Mary was the virgin when Jesus was born? Okay. But by George, you're not going to admit virgin when you're saying the Apostles' Creed, because you're going to throw everybody else off. And the Apostles' Creed is what we believe. Now, the Apostles' Creed is a little more controversial because it's I, but the Nicene Creed is we. And so even if you have doubts about the virgin birth or anything else, what you're affirming that this is the faith of this community. And that doesn't mean that necessarily you'll agree with everything the community thinks, but this is my community. And that leads me to the thing that I didn't hear anybody mention that I think is really important. And that is a lot of the new people coming in, particularly young people, are searching for community. More and more young people are taking jobs far away from their families. And they live in neighborhoods where people don't necessarily know each other. So they're looking for communities of faith, something they can ground their family in, something that won't be changing all the time like everything else does, something they can count on, and a group of people who care about each other, committed to each other, a community of love, justice, yes, we're a community committed to justice and inclusivity, all of those things, but also a community where you can share your doubts. You can share the tragedies of your family and know that you'll be comforted. A community where you can be different, whatever that difference might be, that you'll be still accepted and loved. I think that's a really important piece because that's really the understanding what church, what the community of faith, the body of Christ is meant to be. And so that's an important piece, I think, at least that would be in my elevator talk. We're a community of faith who believes in the transforming love of the unconditional love of God made known to us in Jesus Christ, which we experience liturgically Sunday by Sunday, led by, this would be more than an elevator talk, but led by leaders who are inclusive, who reflect the identity of our communities in terms of gender and race and orientation and so forth. So, have we left out anything? All right, one last slide. So, our prayer book is in the process, it's a 10-year process of revising our prayer book. And this is a big deal. Most of you are too young or too new to the Episcopal Church to remember the 1970s and what we went through when we revised the prayer book last time. Oh, one of the things I said was, I hope I'm dead and gone before we revise the prayer book again. I'm gonna have to go through it again. So what, if you were advised, by the way, the committee that's working, that it's kind of shepherding this, Bishop Dion is on it, as well as Bishop Smith. We have two of this group that are shepherding this process. It'll probably take all this decade to get done. But what would be your advice? What would be some of the emphases? inclusive language, okay?
I kind of have a question. I almost don't remember ever experiencing morning prayers since I sort of miss it.
Okay,
It's been so many years, maybe I don't even remember. Like it's like it's gone now. I don't know if there's ever an occasion that it's.
one of the things we're trying to do is to revise the daily offices and to encourage more and more people to do them together. The daily offices were meant to be, Monday through Saturday. And what we have to do is be able to make those accessible. You could do them and for them to be easier to use for individuals, but to encourage people to do them together. One of the interesting things is more and more people are getting together. One of the Zoom positive things is that people can get together and do Compline. Lots of people doing Compline, which is one of the daily offices, a short one. But yes, I have a strong feeling. I don't know how you feel about cold calls. You know what a cold call is? When you're against it. Well, you should do morning prayer then. Because if you come to Sunday and you haven't done any praying or anything along the way, then Sunday morning becomes a cold call. Well, because you haven't engaged with God for a week. And so God's looking down saying, Susan, who? Oh, that's Susan. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we were, Tammy's doing a class on forgiveness, and this last time, we did, we looked at the book Common Prayer, and the right two is much more compassionate. and
Yes.
caring, And it just feels so much better, and I'm hoping that this new revision will be even better than right two, because I think right one is just cold.
The main thing, because I know we have to stop, one of the main criticisms is the intercessions. There are not enough opportunities for us to pray for the needs of the world in the current ones. And so there's a big effort to have a different set of concerns for the world that's different from each day.
All right, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. We really appreciate it.
All right. And if you're not on Amy's adult forum list,
Yeah, you can talk to me.
talk to her.